Nice. So that was a strange song for us to do, and I had asked them to do this song. And rather than give any kind of segue or explanation, we're just going to play a little video. I played this last time for the first time. Many of you might have seen this. I'm hoping many of you haven't. I'm hoping most of you don't care if you've seen it before. It should almost always be an annual tradition in your house. So we'll show Mr. Bean. Beep, 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 beep. So I know it's one of Brad's favorite moments in the holiday season. He said last year was the first time he'd seen it. I think it's the song "Get Behind Me, Santa" and this whole Mr. Bean thing. I know a lot of folks think of these that maybe feel like this is a bit sacrilegious, perhaps. I know that for my family, that of course, my kids grew up with two clergy in the family, so naturally we have a sense of kind of playfulness and chaos in our household around these times of years. And so throwing various characters in the nativity scene was not unusual. But there's something about this season that brings sort of the childlike out of us. And it brings out this idea in which there's a playfulness that we long for. But I think more than that, there's this idea of inclusiveness. And that's another reason why I wanted to show this thing with Mr. Bean. We have a tendency to sort of mishmash secular and sacred, secular narratives, sacred narratives. And after a while, it gets a little difficult to know what's going on at all. But one thing is very apparent that's distinctive about Luke's story that's not present in Matthew's story. And if you recall, there's only 2 stories of the Nativity in the Bible, in the Gospels. There's only 2 narratives. One is in Matthew and one is in Luke. And what Matthew focuses on is establishing Jesus' lineage to the Davidic line, giving him that sense of authoritative connection, deep roots in the Jewish faith. But what Luke's is all about is different, completely different. It's about inclusiveness. Everybody's in there. And some of the strangest people are in there. Not just the virgin young woman who has the virgin birth and is not married, but also these shepherds. And if you knew what shepherds were in those days, you'd be kind of surprised they'd show up at all. You'd think, why didn't the angel appear to the emperor? Or why didn't the angel appear to the chief priests or the rabbis? Or the Sadducees or the Levites? Why didn't the angels appear to somebody more legitimate? But instead, the angels appear to shepherds, the lowest of the low, sort of like the grunge work, almost like we might think of garbage collectors, perhaps, or someone else in that. And it's just basically sort of the least powerful among the whole hierarchy, and yet they're included. I wanted to read this poem at the beginning. Let's see if Austin can throw it up there. Austin, you running back and forth by yourself back there? Yeah. So Antonio Machado wrote this, and he wrote this in regards to the Camino de Santiago, St. James Way, the pilgrimage route that's in Spain that ends up essentially at the ocean. It starts closer in towards the interior of Spain, but it ends up at the ocean. It's a famous pilgrimage that many thousands of people make every year. But this he'd written a long time back, in, I believe, the early 1900s. Wanderer, your footsteps are the road, and nothing more. Wanderer, there is no road. The road is made by walking. By walking, one makes the road, and upon glancing behind, one sees the path that never will be trod again. Wanderer, there is no road, only wakes upon the sea. The angels looked at the shepherds and said, make your way, go to Bethlehem. And the shepherds say, let us make our way there so that we might see what this is. I think that the Nativity invites us every year at this time. This whole season invites us to remember what it means to make our way. What it means to make our way in the world as people who see something larger, as people who belong or are part of something larger. But the challenge is that we get this mix-up of our theologies so that it's hard to actually figure out how we make our way. I mean, as a kid, when Holy Days came around, that was the only time I got involved in church. Think about where your first ideas of God came from. Probably when you were a child. And they were probably limited to something that was similar, resembled Santa Claus. Someone who intervened on your behalf. Someone who gave you things when you were good and when you needed something desperately. And even then, there was this magical quality to our theology. Now, when I went to church, I was in an Episcopal church. I went primarily on the 3 high holy days. That was Christmas, Easter, and then Mother's Day. I had always been told that the church was God's house. So as a small kid, when I came to church, I came to what I thought was a reasonable conclusion. We came to St. Luke's in San Antonio, which is a huge Episcopal church. And it had this massive chancel area with this great oaken pulpit, and right beside it was a small wooden door with the chancel behind it and the choir loft and choir seats and all. And I always thought, because this fella came through there in this fine robe with this elaborate stole on, that I always thought that he sort of represented God. And his name was the Right Reverend Dr. Graham. Actually, I don't remember if Graham was his last name. I just gave him that name because I don't remember. I was only 5 years old. But I do remember that he was right because that was his official title. And I kept thinking, then there's nothing wrong with him because he's right. And then I remember he was a doctor, which really impressed me because my grandfather was a doctor here in Fort Worth. He was a surgeon, a general surgeon. And so I thought, this is amazing. He's a healer, and he's always right, and he represents God, and he comes out of nowhere. So I always imagined God as being back in that room, wherever that room was, behind that door. And then I only went to church those 3 times. I had no reason to think of anything else. And one Christmas Eve, when we went to a church, it was an evening service, and as we walked in, it was probably back in 1966, right around there. I was about 5, 6 years old. And there was a memorial wall that had been constructed on the side that particular season and in the narthex. And it was probably, there were names written in gold, and I didn't know what those names were. So I asked my mom, I said, well, what are those names? And as we were passing by, it's getting crowded. Everybody's going in for the candlelight service. And she looks at me and she says, be quiet. And I said, but look at all those names. Everybody's stopping and looking at those names. And she said, those are the men who died in the service. And then she said, now be quiet. And as she walked in, I was thinking, did she mean 7 o'clock or 11 o'clock? And I just had this sense of terror. So my ideas of God were, you better be good, you better behave yourself, and he lives behind a door. There was this sense of awesomeness and untouchable nature to God. Over the years, I think probably we can look back and think about our childhood ideas of God and how silly they were. And yet the reality is that sometimes that aspect of God, that childish sort of aspect of God, or I should say that childishness aspect of God, is still present with a lot of people. We see that today in our news all the time. Anne Lamott describes one of her early images of God as your high school principal leafing through your files and not being very pleased with what he finds. The fact is that childhood and adolescent theologies can have a profoundly deleterious effect on our lives and on others' lives as well, especially when they're based either in fear or shame or ambivalence and disinterest. Either of those options seems to leave us with a theology that I think can be very destructive. Either we domesticate transcendence and we just sort of think of it as an everyday sort of occurrence and we don't give it much thought, and we sort of have secularized completely the idea of mystery and otherness and wonder of God, or at the other side of that, we have completely institutionalized it and created basically a theocracy, an oppressive theocracy, where a lot of interpersonal and international evil is a consequence. And we see that happening all the time, and we see it happen even more prominently today. Perhaps we're reminded of it. And while I don't think of these narratives like the Nativity to be a historical account, and I'll say that boldly if I write out here, I don't see these two stories as being historical accounts. In fact, if you look at them and you understand and study the scriptures, what you'll find, what most scholars say, is that they were added towards the end, the same way that a lot of writers will sometimes add the prologue after they've finished writing the novel, because now they really know what this is about. When you look at Matthew's gospel and realize who Matthew is writing to, and you look at Luke's gospel and realize who Luke's writing to, and you look at Mark's gospel, which was the first gospel written 15 to 30 years before the other two, you realize that there's something else going on here. Now, if you dare say he thinks it's ahistorical and therefore unimportant, then you miss the point entirely. All you have to do is to share your story with someone and then hear someone else's story and realize in the listening of that story something significant has suddenly happened. When you've truly listened to someone's story, when you think back on the power of the stories that have changed your life, all you have to realize is that the profoundness of these stories rests not just in the fact that they have lingered and lasted for so long, but also the fact that they speak of something that we all long for, something deep within all of us. Dante's Inferno, the first part of his Divine Comedy that he wrote in the 14th century, has these great lines. Along the journey of this life in the middle, I found myself in a dark wood of night, and the straight path had vanished. This line occurred to me because I think that's essentially where we find ourselves, where many of us find ourselves at this season. And in particular in this season, when we're dealing with so much hatred and anger and xenophobia and even racism, In the midst of all of that, I think we find ourselves in this dark wood. We find ourselves as a nation and as a people struggling with what it means to be a people of faith. And we find ourselves at odds with one another. I think it's interesting that over in Irving this afternoon, they're going to have at the Islamic Center in Irving, they're going to have a gathering of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, mostly the leaders, about 15 different faith organizations or churches represented. It's not an open event. Apparently it was invited, but you can look on news and find out who's there. It's interesting that this gathering has happened in the wake of what all is happening around us. The question becomes, how do we make our way in a world of hatred? How do we make our way in a world of prejudice? How do we make our way in a world of oppressiveness? How do we make our way in a world of shallowness? And the issue becomes, where is God in the midst of all of this? I think when we enter that dark wood, it's an invitation to find something, not an invitation to run. I think when we find ourselves in the midst of these conflicts and these challenges and these anxious events, it's not an invitation to run. In fact, it's an invitation to move forward and to make the way. Isn't it interesting that in all of the Gospels, or in the two Gospel narratives, the only one to have the angels appear is in Luke, and when they appear, what do they say? Don't be afraid. Isn't that fascinating? Now, maybe it's because, like me, you've sat back and you've thought, well, of course, because when angels appear, you're going to be scared. I mean, it's kind of like Supernatural, the TV series, right? I mean, these are profoundly powerful, single-minded creatures. Or perhaps Constantine, that movie, or some of the other movies you've seen where the angels are justice-oriented, they're righteous-oriented. They don't have time for silliness. They basically come in and do what God told them to do. Or maybe your concept of angel is maybe more like Clarence Oddbody in It's a Wonderful Life. Or perhaps touched by an angel. We have these strange notions of what angels are. But I think it's more akin to what it says in Hebrews 13:2 in the Bible, where Paul says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels unaware. This idea of opening up to mystery is profound. It's not a cute little story. It's not a sweet little nativity. It's a profound challenge to reality. Welcoming the stranger because the stranger might in fact be an angel. What is it that we can learn in the middle of the dark wood? One of our favorite poets, I've read this poem in the past, seemed appropriate today. The Sufist poet Rumi wrote this. I have to drink some liquid because the decongestants tend to dry me out completely. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. This being human is a guest house. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep through your house, empty all of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Do not be afraid, the angel says. In the midst of the dark wood, fear is not the response. In the midst of the dark wood, we are invited to make our way. I want to end with just a quick image that came to mind as I was reading through this. Actually, it was because a friend of mine had called me not too long back. Y'all remember Jay Staley, who was a storyteller and came here and visited with us and was a labyrinth builder? Jay comes to Labyrinth not by way of the church. He comes to Labyrinth by way of his own journey in life. And so he began, after being a principal, he began to design and build labyrinths in communities as a way of community development and as a way of bridging different communities, different ethnic groups. So in the 9th Ward in Houston, he got together, and where a Baptist church had burned down because of arson, instead of making it into a parking lot, he proposed a labyrinth, and then the whole community came up out of the Rice University, and with locals from all different backgrounds, they all built this beautiful labyrinth, which is now an ongoing permanent labyrinth. He's since built 2 or 3. He was traveling through the country. He travels all around the world, sometimes studying labyrinths and looking at them and building. He built a couple over in Lyon, France, this past summer. But on his way back from New York after a trip a couple of months ago, he had called me because he asked me about Indiana. He said, "Isn't your wife from Indiana?" And I said, "Yeah, Linda's from Indiana." He said, "Well, then you've been up there." And I said, "Only to Newcastle and in that general area and just east of Indianapolis, visiting with her family on the farm and such." And he said, "You haven't been to New Harmony?" And I didn't know anything about New Harmony. Have any of you ever been to New Harmony? One or just one? Only one. Fascinating little town. He said, "You don't know anything about New Harmony?" I said, "No." He said, "New Harmony is an interesting history. New Harmony is this little town, maybe 750 people now. There's some colleges nearby, but the little town itself is just there. It was started back in 1812 by Rappists, or they called themselves Rappists. They were named after Johannes Rapp, who was a Lutheran over in Germany. But he became a Lutheran separatist. He got even kind of more strict than the Lutheran Reformation. He had some strange ideas, but he also had some interesting ideas about how communities are where you experience the nature of God, how you experience God in the presence of community. And he wasn't experiencing that in the church, even in the presence of the Reformation, as it broken down some of those walls from the Catholic Church. So he moved to the U.S., to the United States, and they formed a community in this little area in the southwest part of Indiana. And they named it New Harmony because they were called, in Germany, they were called the Harmonists. They looked for a way to find harmony. Well, that organization, that group of people believed that Jesus was coming imminently, at any point. And so within just a few years, the whole community kind of started to fall apart. And yet the ideals were solid, but some of the ideas were a little confused, and it left everyone more with doubt than with a willingness to move through it. And so the community dissolved. But they sold it to a Scottish man named Owen. And Owen was this investment developer over in Scotland who made a fortune building things and saw how the Germans in New Harmony were very industrious, so he bought the town, literally bought the town, and they became Owenites, but they became a commune. They were designed not around religious ideals, but around more of a spiritual ideal that people working together can find a common good and serve that common good. And so he brought in scientists, and he brought in philosophers, and he brought in all sorts of geniuses and thinkers. In fact, that area now still hosts a couple of great sort of academic thinking events every year. But the problem with that was there was no one pragmatically minded. And so after only about 5 years, that community also kind of fell apart. Every couple of generations, a new community would come in and would try to build New Harmony into something idealistic. So to this very day, if you go there, there's that presence you'll see that's still there. But the last group, the Owenites, built 2 labyrinths. And they built one of them in the forest with a hedgerow labyrinth, so it's about 3 or 4 feet high, built after the traditional one in Chartres. And then there was another one made of marble. Paul Tillich, the theologian who was from Germany and then eventually was the theologian and philosopher and professor of theology at Harvard, and then eventually in Chicago, Paul Tillich has a park named after him in New Harmony. That was the strange connection. Paul Tillich was a big influence on me in seminary. My professor, Glenn Rout, loved to teach us about Paul Tillich. One of the things that Tillich had always said was that the problem with our faith is that we forget that it is grounded in a being greater than ourselves, and yet in whom we share being, in whom we share reality with. Because we put God out there so far away from us, we limit ourselves to what we are capable of doing in terms of making our way in the world, in terms of making the kingdom in the world. And so Paul Tillich spoke of the very ground of being as being God. When they dedicated the park, see if I can find it here. This is what it said. My friend Jay said this is what they wrote on it. It was written on the day of Pentecost, 1963. Paul Tillich, who was only 2 years from when he would die, stood in the midst of the gathering and spoke these words. He said, "I give my name to this place and dedicate the ground of this park to a new reality, conquering what is estranged and reuniting what belongs to each other in the power of the spiritual presence of God." Neil deGrasse Tyson, who some would accuse of being an atheist, he said, when we accept our kinship with all of life on earth, it is not only solid science, it is also a soaring spiritual awakening. John O'Donohue, the Celtic Christian poet, wrote, "A human life should be a constant pilgrimage of discovery. The most exciting discoveries happen when we are at the frontier. When you come to know something new, when you come closer to yourself and to the world, discovery enlarges and refines your senses. When you discover something, you transfigure some of the forsakenness of the world." The angel said, something is happening, something new. How many of us go to church because we want to hear what we believe, because we want to hear confirmed what it is we think, when in reality, we've shut down our growth and our faith? John O'Donohue, I think, hit it on the mark when he said, it's what we discover at the frontier. The dark woods are always going to be there. Whether it's a doubt in our lives, whether it's an anxiety or a loss, whether it's a pain, a threat of the finality of our existence, whether it's the threat of a radical theological group, the dark woods are always going to be there. The challenge is whether or not we make our way by opening to the invitation, by opening to what is sacred in the midst of even the darkest of places, and finding a path that enables us to experience something new. The definition of joy for me, maybe for you, is not simply what makes you feel good. Deep joy, I think, is what makes you suddenly feel like you're a part of something even bigger. Amen.